honored to be here, folks. I want to say thanks, of course, to the City of Allen, the Allen Public Library, and it is always great when you can show up with a hat like this and be the second coolest hat in the room. Tom, I guess everybody just plays second fiddle to your chapeau, my friend. I appreciate the energy and effort that Tom has put into having me here for this program. I just flew in. I live in Texas, but I just flew in from Las Vegas. I'm a documentary filmmaker. I'm also a camel farmer. This may be probably the most unique introduction you're going to hear in this speaker series here at the Allen Public Library. I do wear many hats. One of them, though, is as a documentary filmmaker. I'll be sharing a film with you tonight that I created a few years ago. But the project that I was working on that brought me in just today from our western states, Nevada and Arizona, is a series of videos that are being put together for the North American Camel Ranch Owners Association. I'm going to let you pause for a minute and digest the fact that there is a North American Camel Ranch Owners Association. If I thought that most of you would be familiar with such an organization or in a larger way the history of camels in North America, then I would anticipate you probably wouldn't be here, all right? Most of the members of our organization aren't here tonight because they know this story. So when I show up to tell this story, one thing I take for granted is that most of the folks in the audience will know little to nothing about this story. And as a storyteller, that really makes it easy for me, right? Now, the series of videos that I've been working on with other camel owners across the country would be to highlight just how present camels are in the USA. Now, that may seem like a shock to you, but it would be because you don't live on a camel ranch. But there are those of us who do. And there's a very vibrant industry, although probably a little bit under the radar, but a very vibrant industry that would include camel fiber, okay? Just like the work that would be done with the wool of sheep or the hair of a goat, any natural fiber. Camel fiber is used in America, and camel owners generally provide their raw fiber to regional or local mills. That's one of the things that's being done with camels in the U.S. And this organization, North American Camel Ranch Owners Association, wants to highlight what's being done with camel fiber. Likewise, we use camels in America for recreation and tourism. There are folks like me who have folks on their camels' backs, and they might give a ride at a Renaissance fair, or maybe you see a camel at a live nativity at Christmas time. I personally have been guiding camel treks in the Big Bend region of Texas for 25 years, multi-day trips on camelback. And this is very much a byproduct of the history of camels in North America that Tom alluded to, with the U.S. Army using camels back in the 19th century. So videos that our association will be producing will highlight the recreation or tourism uses of camels. And the third, here's one that might really, really shock you to know that there is, but we have 10 to a dozen camel dairies in America. People are milking camels. I'm going to let you digest, no pun intended, that one. What does camel milk taste like? It tastes like milk. In fact, the concept of milking a camel is exactly as weird as the concept of milking a cow. It's exactly that weird and no weirder. And we do have 10 to a dozen dairies that run from California to the East Coast up through the Midwest, folks who are milking camels. So again, part of this series of videos that I've been working on helps to highlight what's happening with camel dairies in America. What's the census? What kind of numbers are we talking about? In the U.S. today, we've got about 6,000 camels. Now, that may be an interesting and intriguing number to you, but if you stop and think that probably in Collin County and the rural areas, or any of the rural areas around the Metroplex, there are tens of thousands of cattle. then 6,000 camels doesn't seem that significant. But I assure you, after traveling the U.S. and talking to camel dairy owners and those who use the camel fiber or use their camels for recreation, the work that they do and the income derived from those camels is significant to each one of those families. So while camel milking or camel fiber or even tourism with camels may not be on your radar, it's very much a significant component to the agricultural landscape of America, and certainly significant to each of these families that are involved in that sector. Now, this isn't something that just popped up in the last decade or 20 years. Again, as Tom and I discussed earlier about the 19th century use of camels in America, really created by our government, bringing camels in for military transport out west in the U.S. desert Southwest. That really is the modern beginning of what we see as a U.S. camel industry. But it might surprise you further to know that the camel goes back even farther than the mid-19th century. The camel is a North American native. If TxDOT is doing a road cut or rehabilitating a bridge or a river crossing, any type of archaeology that's done, you're going to find predictably perhaps mastodon bones, perhaps a prehistoric bison. We all hear about one of the epics so many million years ago that Texas had armadillos the size of a VW Beetle, all right? But in among those examples of paleontology, you will always find prehistoric camel bones. In North America, the camel actually goes back 30 million years. So the camel is a North American native. And in the 19th century, when the U.S. government brought camels in to work as pack animals out in the U.S. Southwest, from Texas all the way to California, I really look at it with 21st century eyes like camels are just coming back home where they originated. The horse, too, a North American native. So if we look through the fossil record, camels have been here for millions of years. So when did they disappear? Really between about 9 and 12,000 years ago at the last ice age, as things were changing, and the camel in those days probably didn't look exactly like the camel that you rode on your trip to the Holy Land or to a visit to the pyramids. The camel, like so many animals over the epochs, over the eras, has ebbed and flowed, grown and shrunk. In fact, that original camelid, the kind of the prototype for a camel, 30 million years ago, a little guy called Protolopus, he was about the size of a jackrabbit. Then over the eras and the eons, they grew, they shrunk. To one point, we had one called Alticamelus. Probably doesn't take a Latin expert to know what that means. Very tall camel. Alticamelus stood about 14 feet at the shoulder. Again, this was an era when things were big, right? We had armadillos the size of VW Beetles, small passenger cars. So Alticamelus was about 14 feet tall at the shoulder. That, of course, then, even probably to the casual observer, it begs the question, well, how tall would they have been at the hump in those days? And what we don't know is exactly when, throughout history, throughout time, did the hump, or humps in some cases, develop on a camel. And we can't know that because the hump, filled with fat. There's no skeletal structure to it. Right, on a two-hump camel, their backbone doesn't go like this, right? Their spine runs straight through their back like you or me or a dog or some other mammal. We can't know if there was a hump on a camel skeleton as we excavate or dig through time, because the hump itself is just filled with fat. So there's nothing there skeletal that indicates. But we do look through the fossil record, and we do look at the record of climate change. And we can see that the hump, or at some point in history, humps on the two-hump camel, this adaptation is a reaction to the climate changing. And I think the latest science pretty much agrees that at some point near the last ice age or nearer to the modern time is when humps began to develop. And it was in the Arctic, really a part of what's now Canada, that we start to see humps developing on camels. So what did a camel look like, let's say, 18,000 years ago or 62,000 years ago, probably like a very, very large version of the camel cousin, the llama. But of course, as climate changes, and there's also pressure from paleo man in terms of hunting, so those two things combined move animals around. It brings their numbers down, and obviously, as we talk about millions of years, you can have such drastic changes as Protolopus to Alticamelus to today, the 21st century, in the herd of camels that we have on our farm in central Texas. So millions of years can be hard to grasp your head around, and I promise I'm not going to take you on a journey that deep. Ours today will really take us back to the 19th century when camels return to America. And you know, if the folks involved in the project in those days had had their way, you've probably all heard this about Texas, right? Cattle, crude, and cotton. But if they'd had their way, then maybe we would have been known for cattle, crude, cotton, and camels. Aaron, let's roll that film, please.
Following the gold rush, by the 1850s, pioneer families began crossing the arid interior of North America, but traditional livestock suffered in the hot, dry conditions. In the mid-19th century, American military officers, diplomats, and academics proposed the introduction of camels for use as pack animals in the U.S. desert Southwest. In response, Jefferson Davis, then Secretary of War, introduced legislation appropriating $30,000 for the purchase of camels. With congressional approval, the USS Supply made 2 voyages to North Africa and the Middle East in 1856 and 1857, returning with camels purchased in Tunisia, Egypt, and Turkey, offloading them on the Texas Gulf Coast at the thriving port of Indianola. Once on American soil, the 75 camels were driven overland and headquartered in the Texas Hill Country at Camp Verde, near present-day Kerrville. Accompanying the camels were a handful of native camel drivers, among them Greeks, Turks, and Arabs, hired to tend the animals and teach the American soldiers the art of camel handling. Without hesitation, the camels were put to work hauling supplies between the Quartermaster Depot in San Antonio and their home of Camp Verde, a distance of over 50 miles. Camels became a regular sight on the Texas frontier, along with the more familiar horses, mules, donkeys, and oxen. But greater trials were needed. The Beale expedition of 1857 departed from San Antonio with 24 camels and orders to survey a wagon road from New Mexico to the Colorado River border of California. Along the way, and before leaving Texas, Beale stopped to resupply at Fort Inge, Fort Clark, Fort Lancaster, Fort Davis, and Fort Bliss. The section of road Beale cleared from Albuquerque to California would later be known as historic Route 66. Beale was clearly impressed with the camels.
The more I see of them, the more interested in them I become, and the more I am convinced of their usefulness. Their perfect docility and patience under difficulties renders them invaluable, and my only regret at present is that I've not double the number. Lieutenant Edward Beale, July 1857.
In 1859 and 1860, the U.S. Army topographical engineers conducted 2 90-day expeditions using camels to carry supplies into then unknown West Texas, searching for more practical routes to the U.S.-Mexico border. Staging from the newly established Camp Stockton and exploring what is now Big Bend National Park, the Harts and Eccles expeditions crossed a landscape so harsh and waterless they were eventually forced to abandon their mules. On July 2, 1860, Lieutenant William H. Eccles wrote in his journal,
"We camped dry without any prospects of finding water. We're all very uneasy, not to say a little frightened, for our welfare."
Over the 3-month journey, the camels had to survive multiple days without water. And though at one point the camels' feet had been abraded to the quick, to quote Eccles, the soldiers returned to Camp Stockton without the loss of a single camel. None other than Robert E. Lee, then in temporary command of the Department of Texas, remarked in a letter to Washington,
"The expedition was provided with a train of camels whose endurance, docility, and sagacity will not fail to attract the attention of the Secretary of War, and but for whose reliable services the reconnaissance would have failed."
Despite the praise from those of high rank, the inevitable division of the Union would turn the government's attention away from the camels. Texas aligned itself with the South, and the Confederacy took over Camp Verde along with all its assets. During the Civil War, camel caravans transported southern-grown cotton between San Antonio and Brownsville, Texas, one of the South's only ports not blockaded by the Union. After the war, Jefferson Davis was highly unpopular, and virtually any project he'd been associated with was dismantled. The camels were sold at auction. Freighting operations used Beal's camels in California, Nevada, and Arizona, and camels were put to work packing freight between Texas and Mexico. Camels even helped build the railroad out west. Ironically, it would be trains that would put an end to camel caravans crossing the American desert, but possibly no larger factor than the project's early supporter, Jefferson Davis, doomed the camels more. Perhaps a historical marker at Old Fort Stockton says it best. The camels were a practical success, but a political failure.
Documentary filmmaker and a camel farmer. You might guess that those two things probably individually require other streams of income, right, in America. Who could make a living as a camel farmer? Really, it's hard to make a living as a documentary filmmaker outside of, let's say, Ken Burns. The rest of us struggle, and we're looking to tell stories. And for the greater part of 3 decades, I've told stories. I've traveled to the various forts that were mentioned in the film with our family's camels, telling the story of the 19th century U.S. Army camel experiment. And necessarily, because of those many decades of doing this, I've had a lot of images of my camels literally in the same footprints of the camels that came before us in the 1850s and certainly farther back into the historical record and prehistorical record. But in 2012, the Texas Historical Commission reached out to me. This is a little background on the film. And then when we're wrapped up with a little bit of background on the film, I would love to open it up to questions about the historical use of camels here in America, or my own uses of camels here in modern times. But in 2009 rather, the Texas Historical Commission reached out to me. I'd already been providing camels for historical events and living history programs over the many years at these various frontier forts. And in 2009, it would be the 150th anniversary of one of the expeditions mentioned in the film, the Eccles expedition. While the Beal expedition of 1857 went on all the way to California, It was the 59 and actually 1860 as well expeditions of Eccles and Hartz that surveyed our Big Bend region. So in 2009, it would be the sesquicentennial, the 150th anniversary of these expeditions. And the Texas Historical Commission reached out to me and said, we'd like to reenact a portion of that trail. And what it ended up being was about 70 miles between Fort Lancaster, which is kind of near Ozona, Texas, onto Fort Stockton, Texas, which was also celebrating their 150th anniversary. And what it really boiled down to was going to be about 70 miles of the Eccles Trail. And today that means basically trekking alongside modern I-10. So all the footage you see in the film was shot by a great, great friend of mine, great camel owner and a good filmmaker himself, a great storyteller, Jim Hale. And Jim and I had been on many camel exploits prior. And when this event came up in 2009, the Texas Historical Commission reached out. Jim said, Doug, I want to be on it. I said, that's great. I'd expect you to be there. And he said, but I don't want to handle any camels. And I said, well, what are you doing? He said, I want to film it. Everything we've done up to this point, we've just been so involved and our hands are busy on the trail with camels. We've never really documented any of this. And, well, the book that Tom mentioned, Texas Camel Tales, written in the 1930s, that becomes the first modern telling of this story. And then there's subsequent books about this episode in history, but never, not once, has this story been committed to film. And in my mind as a storyteller, there is no greater story than this one that has been begging to be told visually. So now all of a sudden we had what I thought was a perfect sandstorm, if you will. And that was, we've got a week on the trail with camels, and folks are going to be in historical clothing, and we've got a wagon and mules, we've got infantry, we've got mounted infantry on horse, we've got the camels. And what it really boiled down to was folks slogging along I-10, 70 miles for about a week at 3.5 miles per hour. So you can imagine when I finally sat down with this footage and I tried to figure out what am I going to do with it. We have hours and hours of footage of camels going across the screen, maybe going this way, maybe coming at the camera. But God bless Jim Hale. He had shot some incredible footage, hours and hours of footage. And as I start going through the footage and I'm cutting it up, camels move from right to left, camels move from left to right. I think, you know what, this story can be told fairly quickly. I think that in this modern age, right, with social media, attention spans tend to be pretty short. So I got the idea that I'm going to tell this story in 7 minutes. I wrote a script, planned it out, timed it out, and I think I hit the bullet points. We learn in the film about the politics of the day, right? Jefferson Davis's name is mentioned more than once. Robert E. Lee. While the story of the 19th century camel experiment is not inextricably linked to the Civil War, it does take place roughly in the era of the Civil War. When I give lectures or I'm somewhere with my camels, I tell folks, this is a story that's going to take place before, during, and just slightly after the Civil War. And then folks have at least an idea of the timeline in which this story takes place. So I decided to tell this story in about 7 minutes. And you know, when you sit down to make a film or tell a story, one question you've got to ask yourself as the filmmaker, the storyteller, or the artist is, who is the audience? Who's going to see this? And I thought, well, I've got this great relationship with national parks and historic sites and frontier forts, places I've had the camels for the better part of 30 years. So I'm going to make a 7-minute film that they can show in their visitor center, for example. So every fort from San Antonio to California has got a copy of this. You can see it at the visitor center at Fort Davis. You can see it at the visitor center at Fort Stockton, Texas. So I thought, well, there's an easy audience there. And then I realized that there's a greater audience out there, and it doesn't really require, thanks to the internet, any movement of people. So I put it out on YouTube, and to date we've got over 28,000 views, and every spring I can see those views increase because I know that social studies teachers in Texas public schools are using this film for their 4th and 7th graders. And if that was the only life that this film ever had, it would make me proud. Each year, because we travel with our camels, we're going to see between 20 and 30,000 folks in public events with our camels. But the idea that you can go home and click a link on YouTube and see this film, it just brings me incredible pride. Never made a dime off this film, never had any intention of it turning into something. I just wanted a visual record of this story, and it had never been done. So I'm super proud of it in that regard. It's also had some pretty good legs. It's been shown, believe it or not, at, I'm going to let you take a minute to digest this, international camel conferences. Yes, there are those. It has been shown in the country of Kazakhstan. It's been shown in the UK, always accompanied by the filmmaker and a short Q&A, like we're doing tonight. So to say I'm proud of this film is a colossal understatement. It actually is the first visual storytelling that I ever took on. Since then, I've made many films, short films, longer things for county historical commissions, generally always historical in nature, frequently camel in focus. But this one I'm really proud of because it's the first visual storytelling that I've ever done. It's also an award-winning film from a couple of small film festivals around Texas. So the fact that folks see it, folks are intrigued by it, it makes me so proud. As an artist, that's what you want. You want to share your message with folks. This is really, it'll probably be the only film that I dabble in with the U.S. camel history from the 19th century. But again, a lot of the stories that I tell are camel-centered. Whether it's a saddle maker, you can go to my YouTube channel, and you can see there's a saddle maker in Morocco, a camel saddle maker. Did a film on this fella. Drinking camel milk at a small dairy in Egypt. I've told that story. And it seems like wherever I travel, wherever I work, I always uncover interesting stories, and I try to tell them each time a little differently, where the camel is certainly the foundation of the story, but there's a human element to it, and hopefully that even comes through with the Army Camel film. So there's the kind of the background and how the film came to be and what it has grown into over the, I think, 11 years since I first began working on it. And I think probably, Tom, I think we've got time now to move on to Q&A. Does that work for you?
It does.
Fantastic. Folks, anything you'd be interested in, whether it's the history of the camels itself, that history, the politics of the day, certainly Jefferson Davis and his name connected to the camels, and this history can be a very, very interesting place to discuss. What I do in modern times with my family's camels, or what other folks are doing with camels in America. So Tom has a microphone, and he'll move around the room. If anybody's got a question, just raise your hand, and Tom will head that way and start sharing questions.
Back here.
I have a question about the temperament of camels. You know, you've seen them get angry or fussy or whatever and spit. So when they do that, why do they do that? And are they kind of moody, temperamental like a horse, let's say, or another form of livestock?
Super. I appreciate that question. And it's interesting to note, as a guy who's traveled and worked and educated with camels, for camels, about camels, in America, generally speaking, when a question comes about camels and their behavior or temperament, it will usually be unwittingly by the person asking the question. It will generally come through the lens of a horse. And it's interesting because if we were in an auditorium in Cairo, a question like that wouldn't even come up because everybody's got a camel. My uncle had a camel, grandpa had a camel. But here in the West, we don't even know we're doing it. But when we look at a camel, we're actually saying, can't you be a horse? I want you to be a horse. I want you to be the thing that I'm familiar with, and I recognize that and appreciate it. So some comparison and contrasting is in order here. What we tend to know about camels in the West comes from literature, or in modern times, film. And these are both forms of storytelling. And what does storytelling require? That is drama. So I put forth that the film or the travel log that we see or we read will generally have something about the irascible nature of the camel. It might go something like this. The nomad knelt the camel down. He's gnashing his teeth. He's bellowing. He's spitting. He doesn't want to accept his load. And when he stands up, he kicks and bucks. That's drama. And that propels a story. But it doesn't propel real life. For 5,000 years, nomadic cultures from Morocco to India and across the Himalayas into Central Asia have capitalized on the labor output and potential of the camel. So I would put forth that not once ever in history has a nomad woken up and said, I hope my 80 camels today will be irascible. I expect them to be very, very difficult. I can tell you, as the owner of, at times, a herd as many as 12 camels, that when I go out, I just want an easygoing day, and I expect it. And why do I expect it? Because folks for generations, thousands of years before me, have done this. If we go back, let's say 5,000 years to that first nomad who decided to domesticate a camel, right? He looked around his realm. He said, I'm tired of carrying my stuff. He looked around and said, well, that won't work. Lions eat people. That'd be a bad idea. Let's go with the giraffe. Well, that would be impractical. So they survey the wildlife in their area and they choose a camel. Why? Because they are given to domestication. Now, if we were to line up 100 horses and 100 camels, you'd probably see about the same number of recalcitrant or non-compliant animals. Out of 100, maybe 10, 12 here, 10 or 12 there. So to kind of dovetail around, what we know about camels in the West, if we even know anything, generally comes from film or stories, or your Aunt Ethel who rode a camel for 8 minutes at the pyramids of Giza, all right? I'm not discounting Aunt Ethel's experience, but 8 minutes on a camel at the pyramids of Giza does not make her an expert, okay? So when you're asking about camel behavior and temperament, they're wonderfully gentle. Again, I spend my life sharing my camels with school children, folks in nursing homes, live nativities at churches every Christmas. And I guess I like to say, and this probably comes out a little snarky, you know, but if my camels threw the Magi off their back every year, how many of these churches would ask me back? So camels are incredibly gentle, given to domestication, and I think number by number by number, no more irascible than a horse. I hope that helps.
Back here in the back.
Since my retirement, I've been fortunate to travel on some mission trips, primarily to Africa, to 10 different countries. But I know, like, for instance, Somalia has 3 million. There's several places there that have millions of camels. And so my thought process was, you say that they come from America, and also I'm from, my lineage is other than American. I have actually in me a little bit of Choctaw, Black Cherokee, and actually the Dinka Indians for my relatives from Africa. All of the stories here, they always said that there was a flood, not your ice age. If you go a lot of oral history, which I love, and thank you for the oral history, love that. We need more of it. But my oral history I get is that there was a flood and that people stood to the top of the mountain or the top of the tree, and not your ice age. So I would just be interested in any comments that you have on that.
Without a doubt, I think through these epics of climate change, right? We were an inland sea at a point. So I think that things ebbed and flowed over the epochs. Water moved farther inland in the plains. I think we could look at that through fossil record as flooding. But you would have this ebbing and flowing of tidal waters, low inland seas and inlets of sorts, and I know that bears out through the fossil record. So this part of North America through the last ice age, we certainly use the term ice age. There were no glaciers down here. This was a pretty mild climate 9,000 to 12,000 years ago. There's a great site, in fact, just an hour and a half south of here in Waco, Waco Mammoth National Monument. There are some tributaries into the Bosque River that include the fossil, or not even the fossilized, just the skeletons of about a 62,000 year ago event of Columbian mammoths. And among those Columbian mammoths, about 26 of them, would be a prehistoric camel, right, of 62,000 years ago. So these waters would recede, they would ebb, they would flow. I think that bears out through the fossil record. So I don't want anyone to think that when I say ice age, I'm thinking about glaciers, coming down into North Texas or Central Texas. But certainly with that changing climate, what is now the Gulf of Mexico would have extended well into the U.S. Southeast and up into the Plain States. There are plenty of great videos out there that show basically what the coastline of North America has looked like over the thousands and thousands and millions of years. That would be my thought on that.
I have two questions. One is, didn't Hannibal use elephants and camels to transport military goods over the Alps and into Rome?
Hannibal is certainly more known for his use of elephants, right, into southern Europe, the Mediterranean region. But the use of camels with Hannibal is largely understood to be in North Africa. He and Roman era use of camels actually extends the realm of camels from North Africa across the Mediterranean into multiple places. We even see fossil records today of camels in Roman Britain from that era of about 2,000 years ago, 1,600, 1,800, 2,000 years ago. So Hannibal would certainly be one vector by which camels would have spread, not in any great number. This was a very isolated historical event. He wasn't breeding camels, importing camels, trying to propagate them in mainland Europe. But certainly through the Roman times, we do see the spread of camels into places that we may not modern times associate them.
But my last question is, after these animals were auctioned off, who bought them and what they do with them?
Here in the U.S.?
Yes, sir.
It's a fascinating story, Tom. There were two groups of camels, basically the main group of camels that had been imported in 1856 and 1857, get split up. In the 1857 Beale expedition, 24 camels head west. They go to California surveying, as we learn in the film, what's now modern Route 66 or I-40. Those camels stayed in California. They are auctioned off mid-war. Now, of course, nobody knew it was mid-war. It was just simply 2 years into the war. So in 1863, Beale's camels that he used are auctioned off in California. A fellow named McLaughlin buys them, and he uses them for hauling salt into the newly discovered silver mines in Nevada, Virginia City. And so you've got camel caravans crossing the Sierra Nevadas, hauling salt, which is a part of the refining process for the ore. Here in Texas, it would be post-war in 1866 that a really interesting Austin/San Antonio lawyer and businessman named Bethel Coopwood, he buys the remaining camels left in Texas. There were 66 of those, and he starts a freight line, basically FedEx or UPS, carrying packages from Laredo, Texas to Mexico City for 3 years. And as a fan of history and a storyteller and a historian, there are certainly multiple places in history that I'd love to be able to time travel to. But I'm thinking 3 years of hauling freight through northern and central Mexico on camels. This is a spot in history I would have loved to have been at. So Coopwood does that for 3 years. He says in 1869 he gives this up due to, his quote is, banditry. And he brings his camels back up to Texas. He actually headquarters them right at the south end of Congress Avenue in Austin, right there where it meets the river. Now the lake, they call it. And those camels were set up there on a corner, and he sold 8 here, 10 there, 12 there, 5 there, basically to traveling circuses and menageries of the day. And it's really important to know as we kind of are skirting around this question, what happened to all these camels? Well, there were 75 of them. The majority were male. I'm going to let you think about that. We're going to go back to 10th grade biology, okay? Not a great setup for breeding camels. Most of them were male. Most of those males had been fixed, all right? So by the 1870s, 1880s, although there are great legends about feral camels running around the West, most of those camels had died out. So if kind of in the back of anyone's mind is what happened to these camels, that's what happened. We've got the two groups, one in California, one in Texas, purchased, and they get parted out here and there, and of course they all die out. Camels live to be about 30 years, and again, the majority of them were male.
On the camel hair, goat hair, in particular the ones, the Bedouins in Israel, it has a unique characteristic, and when it gets wet, it'll automatically close out water. Does camel hair have any unique characteristic like that in building something? If you, in order to if you do a tent or something like that, does it have any unique characteristic that you make something with it that makes it unusual?
Absolutely, yeah. Camel fiber, each individual fiber is hollow. Think of it like a drinking straw. And as an ecological purpose for the camel, that means that it's going to insulate the camel both in hot times of the year and in cold times of the year. It's like building a house out of straw bales. The straw, because straw is hollow, is going to hold air within each tube of straw or each camel fiber. So it's great insulation. What you see from Morocco to India and north across the Himalayas into Central Asia, the various camel cultures around the world have always capitalized on the fiber. In fact, outside of hunting, camel fiber is very likely the first human use of camels, all right? They have a natural shed. You don't have to shear them like a sheep. This hair falls out naturally. So obviously nomadic folks 5,000 years ago would have seen camel herds in their realm. Their hair would shed. It would be stuck in an acacia tree. They could take that natural fiber, begin spinning it. So in terms of the functions, whatever folks have done for really with sheep and goats 8,000 to 9,000 years, whatever you've done with the fiber of sheep and goats, camel cultures have done also for the last 5,000 years. And what you see today is a combination of those fibers. When you see a Bedouin tent, for example, the roof is made in the Arabian Peninsula and the Arabic-speaking world, the roof is generally goat hair. And the rains that you would see in the desert, they're not downpours like sometimes we see in central Texas, but a heavy drizzle. And the goat hair fibers of the roofs of these houses, the goat hair will actually expand and it will seal the roof. That keeps the rain from coming in. But the wall panels you'll see are multicolored, generally striped, and that will be a mixture of goat hair, sheep wool, and camel hair. But basically the functions are like any other animal fiber, but there are insulating properties that come just from the inherent hollowness of each camel fiber.
You spoke about camel milk, and I think you kind of implied it might taste like cow milk. Where can you buy that anywhere around here to try it? And the camel dairy, has anybody ever tried to make camel ice cream? And what about camel burgers?
All righty. You need a lot of camels to have a meat industry. That should be the first thing. Today in America, we are milking reasonably between 200 and 300 camels. That's not a lot. Also, the camel's yield, all right, a given camel versus a cow. okay, a bovine. Their output is significantly lower. You're going to see liters and liters from historic cow breeds, Jersey, Guernsey, Holstein, while there are camel milking breeds around the world. Some of the famed ones would come from Turkey or from Saudi Arabia with high yields, still not comparable to the yield of a cow, but the milk, the milk itself, it's going to take on the taste just like a cow milk would if a cow was simply grazing, not being given any supplemental feed like, let's say, alfalfa or a pelleted, concentrated feed supplement. So whatever a cow would eat, whatever a goat or a camel would eat is going to color or flavor the milk. When you're drinking raw camel milk, let's say in the Sahara, you're typically going to have a bit of a salty taste because the majority of plants that grow in deserts are salty. Camels have a high salt requirement, so they're seeking out salty plants. And that is not to say that in America, the milk that you would source online through various raw milk co-ops, things like that, I can explain those a little bit more in detail, but obviously, we don't have free-ranging camels in desert areas where they're going to be eating their favorite salty desert plants. So the management of camels in dairies here in the U.S. mirrors a little bit the management of cattle in a dairy. They're fed hay. They might be given a supplement, a concentrated feed supplement. That's dairy by dairy, their choice. But it's going to be a very smooth and consistent flavor. There's a camel dairy in Colorado that does on basically the eastern slope of the Rockies, kind of the western edge of the plains. Those camels do free range and they are fed a baled hay. So their milk can the taste can vary throughout the year based on what they're eating. And this is raw milk, okay? There are 2 dairies in the U.S. that are pasteurizing camel milk as well. And those dairies offer the option for raw milk or pasteurized. But in general, the flavor is very pleasing. I drink camel milk every day of my life, either from the dairies that I have relationships with or from our own camels. We've got one milking right now named Cindy. She's a first-time mom. She doesn't have a lot of output, but I milk each day just to keep her kind of in practice for doing so. But it's a good taste. There's nothing strong. I think people kind of naturally think, oh, does it taste like goat milk? And sometimes goat milk can have a strong taste, if not odor to it. But even that's not fair because there are goat milk dairies that you could drink that milk and not even know it's anything different. The viscosity of camel milk is a little bit like skim milk for a cow. It's certainly a little thinner in viscosity than, say, whole milk that you'd buy at the grocery store from a cow. But it's certainly, it's very filling. There are all kinds of properties that camel milk has that cow milk doesn't. I'm also not a lobbyist for the camel milk industry, okay? But I can tell you that if you're lactose intolerant, and you have some problems with cow milk or ice cream, camel milk doesn't give you any of those gut issues. Very, very high in vitamin C. There's a natural insulin in it. There's some early studies from Western medicine that indicate that camel milk can be helpful for folks with diabetes, Crohn's disease. Today, the big market for camel milk, there are 2 markets really for camel milk in the U.S. One would be, and this is the smaller portion, immigrants from the Middle East and North Africa who grew up drinking camel milk. And the larger portion of the camel milk market is really supported by mothers of autistic children who have found that camel milk can be helpful in kind of moderating some of the more stimming behaviors that autistic children might have. I hope that was helpful.
camel burgers and camel ice cream.
Yeah, we've got to have obviously a lot more camels to have a meat industry. Today, our hamburger, our beef industry comes certainly from production cattle, but in dairies, right, the male offspring isn't very helpful in a dairy. So those cows are going to go to market. They're what we're eating at the burger joint. We don't have that yet in number for camels. We would have to have tens of thousands before you start to see a meat market, a camel meat market in America. Although you can buy camel meat, it's imported from Australia. That's an entirely different, incredible story. Basically parallels our own flirtation with camels in the 19th century. Camels were imported by the 10,000, basically, into Australia from modern India. And those camels have turned feral, not unlike our feral hogs here. They become a bit of a nuisance in the outback in some places, so very enterprising folks will round those up in Australia. I want to make sure we're clear here. We don't have feral camels in America. But in the outback of Australia, something like 1/3 300,000 feral camels. Enterprising folks will round those up, bring them into the abattoir, and the camel meat that we would see in any market here in America will be frozen and shipped in from Australia.
Two questions, one of which doesn't matter whether it's factual or not. Were there any folklore stories of camels getting loose here in Texas? And 30 years later, instead of the ghost appearing in the canyon, we see a camel in somebody's backyard and somebody tells the story about it. Doesn't matter whether it's true or not.
Well, no story, you can't handle a little bit of an embellishment, right, Tom?
Right.
Factual. Right off the bat, we have to understand, right, the majority of these camels that were imported were male. Okay, not a great setup for breeding. Camels live to be really in the best of conditions about 30 years old. Okay, so let's say that at the end of the Civil War, 1866, you had a 10, 15, 20-year-old camel. They've got 10 more years of life left in them. So now we've got camels that are going into the 1870s, maybe by the 1880s when rail starts to cross Texas, all right? So the idea that somebody saw a feral camel in Winslow, Arizona in the 1930s, I love that story. And I want with all my heart for it to be true. When I travel with my camels out in West Texas, there will always be some crusty old timer that comes up and say, yeah, back in the 60s, I was out hunting mule deer and I saw me some wild camels. I'm not going to be the guy that argues with the old fella. I'm not. But I want this to be true. In 2023, please, Lord, let there be feral camels in the West. I want that to be true. And I'll tell you why. Because one of my camels that I bought, golly, he's 11 years old now, so 10 years ago I bought him as a 2-year-old. I don't mind telling you, he cost me $5,500. Now, that was a decade ago. They're not that price today. But if you're telling me that there are feral camels free, roaming, all I need is a rope and some adventure spirit, right? If they're free out west, why am I spending thousands of dollars for camels? I want with every fiber of my being for there to be free camels out west. I really want that to be true. It's not happening. Did it happen at a point, Tom? It did. There were probably, if you put a gun to my head and say, what was the number, Doug? I would say out west there were 24 3 dozen feral camels, 1 that got away here, 3 that got away there, but not in any great number and not enough to support this great myth about the U.S. Army camel experiment. One of the great myths is after the war, the government simply turned the camels loose to fend for themselves. That's like as we left Afghanistan, we just leave the motor pool open, the gates open, the keys are in the Humvees, and it's got a full tank. We sold those vehicles to the Afghan army and government. The camels post-war were still military government property. They were sold. Again, we know who bought them. McLaughlin in California, Coopwood in Texas. It doesn't mean that there weren't feral camels, and it doesn't mean that there aren't some great stories. The Red Ghost is one of them out west, but it's kind of a Washington slept here story. If you look through the 1870s, 1880s, even into the 1890s, we hear about this kind of phantasm of a camel that, well, he's in Globe, Arizona, then he's over here in the Coconino Forest and the Kaibab National Forest of northern Arizona. He's all over the place. The Red Ghost, the Red Ghost. I want these feral camel stories to be true, but I think over time they kind of grow and expand. And again, no story is so good that it can't stand a little embellishment, but I think that's where those feral camel stories come from.
Where can you buy camel milk locally?
Yeah, so in the U.S. in general, most folks buying camel milk are buying it directly from the dairy. In California, there are a few grocery stores that stock it. But generally speaking, if you're looking to source camel milk in North America, you're going to buy it directly from the farmer. And what they tend to do, let's say you decided to buy yours from the farmer in Colorado or West Virginia or Missouri, they're going to ship it frozen, 2-day shipping. So it arrives in a big box, all frozen, and you part it out a pint a day, whatever you want. But it's generally done that way and just direct from the farmer. There are some online brokers of camel milk with various names. You can actually go to Amazon, type in camel milk. You'll see these various brokers. They're resellers, basically. They buy the milk from the farmer. They slap a brand label on it that they have, a snazzy name for. But it's not hard to find. You simply go online and buy it.
We have one question. Go ahead.
I have 2 quick questions. The first one is around intelligence. Just can you give us your perspective on kind of the range? How trainable are they if you use them for, say, entertainment? And then the second question is around mothers and babies. So when a mother camel has a baby, many times, like if it's an elephant, they will separate the baby from the mother for a period of time because she can reject the baby, and they wait for the baby to get a certain age. Is that true with camels, or do they acclimate just like a horse would or any other type of animal like that?
Sure, we'll kind of go in reverse there. My experience with my own camel herd over the years, breeding camels, and my own experience with folks with camels abroad in places I work, Morocco, India, Jordan, Egypt, long camel cultures. Mother has a baby. Within 6 hours, the baby is standing and nursing, and they are a pair, and the baby's going to nurse for a year. If you're looking for the milk, a year is great. A year and a half is even better. They can be weaned by about age 5 months. They're certainly already eating solid food by then, but no separation is needed. For those who are dairying, like on any level, if I want a reliable source of milk from, say, Cindy, who I've got lactating right now, the standard management would be overnight to separate the baby from the mother, just so her milk will build up. Then in the morning, when you put the two together, the calf, we would say, using English bovine terms, the calf would begin nursing. That's going to stimulate the milk flow from the mother, and you let the baby take, let's say, 2 of the teats. There are 4. On the udder of the camel. They're gonna, the baby will take 2, and you're working off of 2, and that buildup overnight is gonna be sufficient so that you can milk to any reasonable yield for household needs, all right? So no separation like for any period of time other than to let milk build up overnight, okay? Some cultures will simply let their calves nurse morning and evening, and that's gonna guarantee the human take is much higher. When we're nursing, when we're lactating or milking a camel at our home, I tend to let the baby have a whole lot more than, say, somebody, a nomad in Egypt or, the Sahara would do. I don't have to have the milk as a staple of my diet like a nomad might. So I tend to be a little softer on that mother and calf relationship. All right, so no separation of any type like you described. To speak to their intelligence, I would say most Americans know something about a horse. I think if we were to walk down the street in Manhattan and you find the guy in that fine suit with a briefcase and say, "What do you know about a horse?" He's going to know something. His uncle had a farm. He rode one at summer camp. He's going to have some knowledge of a horse. And I think if I had a horse here tonight, most of you would understand we need to be careful when we walk around the back end. They could kick, but we would need to explore why a horse might kick, right? A horse kicks, and this is super kind of elementary here, but a horse kicks only and only because they believe that whatever just happened behind them is a predator. Now, we can see that it's, oh, the wind blew my hat off, or, something came flittering in the wind. But a horse doesn't see things that way. They see it one way. Is that a predator? That's it. That's all they're capable of understanding. Something that happened around me is a predator, and I'm going to react like a prey animal. The end. That's all a horse is capable of thinking. Okay? Now, horses have evolved in places where there are lions and wolves and all kinds of predators, certainly through the domestication period of 6,500 years with horses, 5,000 years with camels, and we're gonna talk about the two different species: the one-hump camel, the Arabian camel, and the two-hump species, the Bactrian camel. We're going to talk about them separately for a moment. The Arabian camel has evolved and been domesticated in places you might expect. The Sahara, the Middle East. These are places where there are virtually no predators. So when a horse reacts to something in their realm, and that is simply a predator in their mind, that same stimulus, whatever it is, flag flapping in the wind, my hat blew off, you're generally going to see a sharp reaction from the horse. It's simply them trying to survive. It's protection for themselves, either running or kicking. But if that exact same stimulus, whatever it is, a Walmart shopping bag flitting in the wind, or my hat blows off, or a kid comes running through the space, the camel is less likely to bolt and spook. Now, this speaks to not only their intelligence, but also just their environmental adaptations and their own evolution and the specific ecology or environment in which they evolved and adapted. So a camel might take that same stimulation or same stimulus, and instead of bolting, running, jumping, they're simply going to turn and look. They want to make sense of what that is, because for the better part of easily 5,000, if not a few more thousand years than that, the Arabian camel, again, the one-hump species, has evolved and lived in a place where there virtually are no predators. So they don't filter their decision-making through, is this thing, whatever the thing is it going to kill me? So this becomes a very interesting component to training and gauging intelligence. I actually came to camels with no history whatsoever of working with livestock. So I wasn't burdened with all of that neurosis that is required to understand with horses. Well, you got to be careful. They could kick. Why would they kick? Well, they think it's a predator. I'm not burdened by that. I start working with a camel, and I don't think about that. Now, it doesn't mean that I'm foolhardy. It doesn't mean that I, bang two trash can lids as I walk around. Certainly, a camel can spook, but the way that I try to quantify it is a bit like the volume knob on a stereo. If the thing, the stimulus that would get a horse to spook is at, let's say, volume level 3, the same incident would take cranking that volume up to about 11 to get a response from the camel. Not because they're better, not necessarily because they're smarter, although I do believe they are of higher intelligence, and we can kind of discuss that. But because they don't filter everything through, is that a predator? Now, that's the Arabian camel. The two-hump camel is actually a little bit more alert and a little more closely aligned to these concepts of fight or flight that you would understand with equines, with horses, donkeys, mules, zebras, even in a wild equine. The two-hump camel, the Bactrian camel, has evolved in and still lives in an environment where there are predators. There are wolves in Central Asia, there are snow leopards in Central Asia. So training one versus the other, the Arabian versus the Bactrian, does require that understanding. So you approach the Bactrian a little differently in your mindset to understand that they're going to be a little more highly attuned, a little more on alert, okay? But just to kind of throw a blanket on intelligence, camels are certainly not dog or porpoise or chimpanzee intelligent. But if we're looking at a scale here, we've got dog up here, here's horse, there's cow down here. Camels are going to be a little higher on that level of intelligence than a horse.
Real quick question. The camels that were in the part of Africa where there were lions, they're the two humps?
One.
One hump.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. And again, these are two different species. The Arabian is the one hump. Bactrian is the two hump. You likely know the word dromedary. Dromedary is another kind of general term for the one hump camel.
Okay, I got a little story about a feral camel.
I love it.
Yeah. Our daughter, she's 21 now, but when she was about 3-ish or so, we were in Colorado, and we were around Ouray and Ridgeway and all, and we were on the oil roads. We weren't on the big highway or something. We're driving around, and of course we point out all the antelope and the deer. She knows what cows are. She didn't care about the cows. We're pointing those out, and then she goes, "Well, there's a camel." And we're like, "Oh, how cute." Came back by later that evening, and it was a camel farm there or whatever, but you couldn't have convinced her. She was sure that she had seen like wild antelope, deer, camel.
Sure,
because
sure.
camel don't belong there.
It is not uncommon on a road trip, right? Especially in Texas through the hill country where we have exotic, animal ranches, things like that, and certainly in our western states, it's not uncommon to see a camel. And I think, from a kid's perspective, if they were to see, wild animal, camel, well, it kind of gets lumped in there. But I can assure you, if there were a feral camel in America, if I wasn't doing it, some of my buddies in the camel industry would be out there roping free camels, all right? And again, I want it to be true. I want there to be free-ranging camels. I'd really love that. My pocketbook would particularly like it. You got another, Tom?
You do.
All right.
By the way, your answers are absolutely enthralling.
Well, thank you. I just make it up every time, Tom.
Keep making them up.
No, I appreciate the kind words. For 30 years I've told this story. I've researched this. It is the thing I love. It is the thing that I do. Don't ask me how the Rangers are doing this season. I don't know. I'm not that guy. But when it comes to camel history, I'm your man.
Thank you so much. You talked a little bit early on about geography and the aeons of time where the different evolutionary types of camels have resided, and with the flow of glaciers down and back with various ice ages, while the glaciers certainly didn't come down to Texas that we're aware of, at least the most recent one, and with glaciers receding, I know it's a lottery ticket type situation, but what are the chances of possibly finding a more intact, not just skeletal, fossilized remains of a camel? Were there geographies that kind of overlapped there, or, with the slow move of glaciers, would they have, avoided, what we've seen some, fossilized remains of frozen animals where there is more meat?
Yeah, well, we certainly see, if we expand our scope outside of North America, we certainly find, let's say in Russia and Siberia, frozen intact mastodons, right? Mammoths from tens of thousands of years ago. There's some interesting, very, I think, questionable science even going on now to mix DNA from these frozen mammoths with modern elephants, and the idea of basically cloning a prehistoric elephant version using a modern elephant to bring that to life. We have not, as yet, seen anything like that with camels. Where would we be most likely to see it? Certainly in the northern reaches of Canada, where we see the last North American camel of 12 to 16,000 years ago. You know, so many things would have to happen to make that work, right? We may all know of the great Alpine gentleman Ötzi, right? He's like 5,600 years old, something like that. There's a perfect storm that happens to get an intact figure, be it human or animal, in those settings. I would love to see something like this. It would, I think it would answer a lot of questions for us, but the fossil record is there. If not the, you know, the genetic component of hair and DNA that would be a little more easily accessible.
Hold on, let me bring you the mic because we can't, the others can't hear you.
Thanks, Tom.
You mentioned early on that whether there was a hump or how was it, if there was there or not. And of course, if there was the 1 in 10 million chance of actually finding one, that possibly that would be, you know, noticeable. But that was just my question.
Yeah,
It
would. This would be that perfect storm that you would have one frozen intact somewhere in tundra or within a glacier or some kind of ice field. That would be wonderfully helpful for us. But I think that science, and again, I'm a camel farmer from Central Texas, all right? But I think that would be incredibly helpful. There was a very interesting that happened in Dubai not quite 20 years ago. Science wanted to bridge. It was simply a question that had already been answered scientifically, at least theoretically, but in practical form, there was a genetic bridge that was made, and it was basically an idea to see what an earlier version of the camel looked like before Protolopus, right? Let's go to our prototype of a camel. Before he split off into these various things, we actually have 6 members of the camel family today. It's the 1 and 2 hump camels, and then the 4 llama-like cousins of South America, the llama and the alpaca, which are domesticated versions of the guanaco and the alpaca. But a question was asked about 2 decades ago in Dubai. Could we find a point at which the llama version, the South American camelid, and what we think of as the Old World camels kind of came together. So through science, there was something created called a kama, like camel, llama, that was brought together. And that's been done. I've heard various researchers say there was no practical reason to do it. We knew theoretically what could happen and what the outcome would be. So there are ways to kind of get glimpses into what did these various camel versions look like over the span of time. All right?
Any last minute questions, comments, or protests? We can take protests too. One reason I wore my patriotic outfit today is because I formerly associated the camel with the military applications before and during the war, the Civil War, particularly the expeditions to California and so forth. But one thing I learned tonight, there was non-military applications of the camel. That's my big takeaway from tonight. Going down into Mexico City, carrying goods and so forth. And tell them how you can, they can go to your website and Facebook page and that sort of thing. By the way, when he sent me the picture to publicize the program, he was in a blue Army uniform and with the camel behind him. And it was a great picture.
Thank you so much. Yeah, you can follow our exploits in terms of the U.S. Army Camel Experiment and propagating and perpetuating that history on Facebook, U.S. Army Camel Experiment, very easy to find. My own profile on Facebook is simply my name, Doug Baum. If you don't want to see camels, you probably shouldn't go there. Instagram is also Texas Camel Corps, and that follows all kinds of exploits and my own photography and videography endeavors, generally always relating around camels or camel travel. But easy to find online, Google Camels, Texas. I'm generally the guy who's going to come up.
One impressive that I find most impressive about your presentation tonight is your prodigious knowledge of the scientific nomenclature of the various species and the ecological surroundings of the various species. You use words, I didn't know what they were.
Thank you so much, Tom. I appreciate that. The kind words are not taken for granted. I love this story. I love the camel connection, certainly geographically to North America, the history of our own country, and quite proudly the fact that this Army story of the 19th century really emanates and takes place. It starts here in Texas, certainly spreads out to the greater U.S. Southwest, but this is a story that I think I was born to tell, and I take a lot of ownership in this story, and I think it should be told as closely as I can today in the 21st century with accuracy and with totality. So the reading that I do is prodigious. Again, I'm not the guy to ask, how are the Cowboys doing this season? It's just not what I do. But when it comes to camel history,
I didn't hire you for that.
Tom, thank you so much, folks.
Any last minute questions? Doug Baum, thank you.
Thank you all.